On Halloween night 1978, an entire town burned down a woman's house. They called her the monster. They said she cursed children, that her face was divine punishment, that she deserved every stone they threw at her window. That night in October, 300 people marched with burning torches, shouting, furious, demanding she leave town. When she refused to open the door, they set it on fire, and as the flames consumed everything she owned, the crowd applauded. 40 years later, in 2018, I discovered the truth about that night, the truth about who that woman really was, and what she was hiding in that house. And when I finally understood why, I wished I had never found out. Because you see, I was there that night. I was 8 years old, and my father was at the front of the crowd, holding one of the torches. I am the billionaire butler. For decades, I served the wealthiest families the world has ever known. Behind closed doors, in whispered conversations, I heard the secrets that built empires and the betrayals that destroyed them. I witnessed fortunes rise overnight and vanish in silence. Simply by observing, I discovered the hidden principles that turn ordinary men into billionaires. And though I was merely the butler, those secrets made me wealthy beyond measure. But this story, this is not about the wealth I built or the fortunes I witnessed. This is about the greatest injustice I ever saw. And it took 40 years and the death of my own father for me to finally understand the truth. A truth that changed not just how I see money, but how I see human nature itself. Because in 1978, my town destroyed an innocent woman. And what I discovered decades later still haunts me every single night. Let me take you back to the autumn of 1978, to a small town in Connecticut called Millbrook Falls. Population 3,217. The kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where doors stayed unlocked, where children played in the streets until the streetlights came on. It was the kind of town people called idyllic, safe, wholesome, picture perfect, but it was built on a lie. A lie that would take 40 years to unravel. Her name was Eleanor Hartwell. She was 43 years old that Halloween. She had lived in Millbrook Falls her entire life, born there in 1935. Raised there through the Depression and the war years. Should have died peacefully there, surrounded by people who loved her. Instead, they tried to kill her. But I'm getting ahead of myself again. I do that when I think about Eleanor. When I think about what we did to her, what I watched happen and did nothing to stop. Let me start properly. Let me tell you who Eleanor Hartwell was before that night, before the fire, before everything changed. Eleanor Hartwell had a scar, a burn scar that covered the left side of her face, from her temple down to her jaw, dark red and mottled purple, the kind of scar that made people look away quickly, made children point and whisper. Made strangers cross the street to avoid passing too close. She got it when she was 7 years old, a kitchen accident. Her mother was cooking soup on the stove, one of those old cast-iron pots that weighed more than the child trying to help move it. The pot tipped. Boiling liquid spilled. Eleanor's face was in the wrong place at the wrong time. Her mother blamed herself until the day she died 20 years later, spent every penny they had on doctors and treatments and salves that promised to reduce the scarring. Nothing worked. The burn was too severe, too deep, the kind of injury that marks you for life. But here's what you need to understand about Eleanor. That scar was not who she was. It was something that happened to her. Just like some people are born with brown eyes or red hair or a birthmark on their shoulder, she never let it define her, never let it turn her bitter or cruel or withdrawn. When Eleanor was young, before the scar hardened people's hearts against her, she was known throughout Millbrook Falls for her kindness. She helped elderly neighbors carry groceries. She volunteered at the library on Saturdays. She sang in the church choir with a voice people said was beautiful enough to make angels jealous. She had dreams, like any young woman, wanted to be a teacher, wanted to get married and have children, wanted the simple good life that small towns promise to those who are born there. But Millbrook Falls, like many small towns, had a dark side, a side that reveals itself slowly, like rust spreading across metal you thought was solid. By the time Eleanor reached her 20s, something had shifted. Maybe it was always there, lurking beneath the pleasant smiles and the Sunday morning church services. Maybe it just needed time to show itself. People started avoiding her. Not openly at first. Nothing you could point to and say, there, that's prejudice, that's wrong. Just small things, subtle things, the kind of things that are easy to dismiss individually but add up to something devastating over time. Store clerks would serve other customers first, even when Eleanor had been waiting longer. Neighbors would end conversations when she approached. Children would run away when she tried to say hello. Job applications went unanswered. Invitations stopped coming. By her 30s, Eleanor had learned a painful truth, that in a small town, being different is dangerous. Being marked, even through no fault of your own, makes you a target. She adapted the only way she could, made herself smaller, quieter, less visible. She started working from home, doing seamstress work for people who were willing to pay her as long as they didn't have to see her face. They would leave fabric and patterns on her porch at night. She would complete the work and leave it out the next evening. Money would appear in an envelope, no words exchanged, no acknowledgement that a human being lived in that house and had feelings and deserved basic dignity. She shopped for groceries at 5 in the morning when the stores had just opened and the aisles were empty. She attended church services but sat in the very back pew, arriving late and leaving early, slipping in and out like a ghost. She had no friends, no social life, no human connection beyond the bare minimum required for survival. But Eleanor Hartwell hurt no one. She asked for nothing beyond what she needed to live. She simply tried to exist in the only home she had ever known. And for years, Millbrook Falls allowed her to exist, ignored her, pretended she wasn't there. It wasn't kindness, but it wasn't outright cruelty either. It was a cold tolerance, a mutual agreement to coexist without interaction. That fragile peace held for nearly 20 years. And then the summer of 1978 arrived, and everything changed. I need you to understand something about small towns. About how rumors work in places where everyone knows everyone, and there's not much else to talk about. Rumors in small towns are like fires in dry grass. They start small, a spark, a whisper, and then they spread faster than anyone expects, feeding on fear and boredom and the human need to have an explanation for things we don't understand. That summer was strange in Millbrook Falls, unusually hot, the kind of heat that makes people irritable and restless. Crops failed in several farms, a late frost in spring, then a drought in summer. Bad luck for farmers who depended on good harvests. Mrs. Patterson's daughter got sick in June. High fever, vomiting, seizures. The doctors couldn't figure out what was wrong, ran test after test. Eventually the girl recovered, but it took weeks, and Mrs. Patterson was terrified the whole time that she would lose her child. I remember hearing my mother and Mrs. Patterson talking over coffee one afternoon. I was 8 years old, playing with toy soldiers on the floor, half listening to adult conversation the way children do. Mrs. Patterson was crying, saying she didn't understand why this had happened to her daughter, saying she must have done something wrong, something to deserve this punishment. And my mother, trying to comfort her, said something I didn't think much about at the time. She said, "Did you see Eleanor Hartwell near your house recently?" Mrs. Patterson stopped crying, looked up, thought about it, and said, "Actually, yes. The day before Sarah got sick, I saw her walking past our house. She looked at Sarah playing in the yard." My mother nodded slowly, said, "Maybe that's it then. Maybe she gave Sarah the evil eye." I remember thinking that was a strange thing to say, the evil eye, like something from a fairy tale. But I was 8 years old, and my mother was an adult, and adults knew things children didn't. Mrs. Patterson latched onto this explanation like a drowning person grabbing a rope, started telling other people. Eleanor Hartwell had looked at her daughter. Her daughter got sick. Eleanor Hartwell had caused the sickness. It was nonsense, of course. Correlation without causation. A sick child and a woman walking down a public street. Nothing connecting them except proximity and timing and a desperate need to blame someone for random misfortune. But in a small town in 1978, that was enough. The rumor spread. Other people started remembering times they had seen Eleanor near their houses before something bad happened. Mr. Morrison's business deal fell through, and someone remembered Eleanor had sewn his wife's dress for a party. Started saying she must have cursed the fabric, cursed his fortune. The Thompsons' dog died, and they swore they had seen Eleanor walking past their house the week before. Never mind that the dog was 14 years old and had cancer. Eleanor Hartwell must have done something to it. One by one, every small misfortune in Millbrook Falls that summer found its way back to Eleanor Hartwell's door. And she had no way to defend herself, no friends to speak up for her, no one willing to say, "This is ridiculous. Correlation is not causation. Bad things happen for reasons that have nothing to do with a woman with a scarred face." The rumors grew darker, more elaborate, more divorced from reality. People said they saw lights in her windows at odd hours, said they heard strange sounds coming from her house, said animals avoided her property, said the grass didn't grow right in her yard, said the air felt colder when you walked past her house. I heard these things at dinner tables, at school, in church. Everywhere I went, people were talking about Eleanor Hartwell and the terrible things she was supposedly doing, and I believed them. Because I was 8 years old, and everyone I trusted was saying the same thing, and who was I to question the unified certainty of an entire town? My father came home from work those evenings with his jaw tight and his eyes hard. He worked at the post office, a government job, steady and reliable. He prided himself on being a responsible member of the community, a good citizen, a man who did the right thing. He would sit at the dinner table and talk about Eleanor in low, angry tones. How she was a blight on the town, how her presence brought bad luck to good people, how someone needed to do something before more children got hurt, more businesses failed, more innocent people suffered. My mother would nod and agree. She always agreed with my father. It was expected. That's how marriages worked in 1978, at least in Millbrook Falls. The husband decided, the wife supported, questions were discouraged. I absorbed their fear like a sponge absorbs water. Learned to be afraid of Eleanor Hartwell without ever having spoken to her, without ever having seen her do anything wrong, just because everyone around me was afraid. And fear is contagious. That's how hatred spreads, you understand. Not through speeches or manifestos or organized campaigns, through dinner table conversations, through casual agreements, through the quiet, steady drumbeat of ordinary people reinforcing each other's prejudices until they become accepted truth. By September, the rumors had reached a fever pitch. People were genuinely afraid, genuinely convinced that Eleanor Hartwell was dangerous, that she had supernatural powers, that she was using those powers to hurt innocent people. I know how this sounds. I know how absurd it is that educated people in 1978 could believe such things. But you have to understand, fear makes people irrational, gives them permission to believe things they would normally dismiss, lets them act in ways they would normally find unconscionable. And Millbrook Falls was very, very afraid. Then, 3 days before Halloween, something happened that transformed fear into action. A child went missing. His name was Michael Chen, 7 years old, son of the family that owned the Chinese restaurant on Main Street. Quiet kid, good student. The kind of child you never worried about because he always did what he was told. Michael didn't come home from school on October 28th. His mother called the school. The school said he had left at the normal time, called his friends. No one had seen him. By 6 o'clock, the police were involved. By 7, search parties had been organized. By 8, the entire town was combing through the woods and fields and abandoned buildings, calling his name, praying they would find him safe. I remember the panic, the way adults moved with jerky, frightened urgency, the way my mother cried, and my father paced, and everyone spoke in sharp, clipped sentences. They searched all night. Hundreds of people with flashlights and dogs and desperate hope. I stayed home with my mother, too young to help, listening to the phone ring constantly with updates that were never good news. They found Michael 18 hours later, at 2 in the afternoon on October 29th. He was sleeping in a treehouse he and his friends had built in the woods behind the elementary school. He had gone there after school to play, had fallen asleep in the autumn sunshine, had slept straight through until the next afternoon, exhausted from a week of staying up late doing homework. He was fine, hungry and confused about why everyone was so upset, but completely, totally fine. The relief in Millbrook Falls was palpable. Parents hugged their children. Neighbors embraced. The police chief held a press conference praising the community for coming together. Everyone agreed it was a miracle. But in those 18 hours between Michael going missing and Michael being found, something terrible had been planted in the collective mind of Millbrook Falls. Someone, I don't know who, I wish I knew so I could name them, someone had started a rumor. They said they saw Eleanor Hartwell near the woods that afternoon. Said she was walking along the edge of the forest around the time Michael went missing. Said she had a strange look on her face. Said she was muttering something under her breath. Someone else said they saw her smiling when the search parties went past her house. Said she looked pleased that a child was missing. Said there was something evil in her expression. Someone else said they heard her whispering in a language they didn't recognize. Said it sounded like a chant, like a curse. Like something ancient and dark. None of this was true. All of it was speculation and imagination and fear manifesting as false memory. But it didn't matter. By the time Michael was found safe and sound, Millbrook Falls had decided. Eleanor Hartwell had tried to take that child, had used her evil powers to lure him away, had been thwarted only by blind luck and the determination of good people who refused to let evil triumph. The fact that Michael had simply fallen asleep in a treehouse was irrelevant. The fact that Eleanor Hartwell had nothing to do with anything was irrelevant. The town had made up its mind. Eleanor Hartwell was dangerous. Eleanor Hartwell had tried to hurt a child. Eleanor Hartwell needed to be stopped. The meeting happened 2 days later, October 29th, 1978, 7 o'clock in the evening at the town hall. 300 people packed into a space meant for half that number. Standing room only. People lined up along the walls, filled the aisles, crowded in the doorway. The air thick with rage and fear and something I couldn't name as a child, but recognize now as bloodlust. My father took me to that meeting, made me go. Said I needed to understand what was happening. Said I needed to see how a community protects itself. Said I was old enough to learn that sometimes good people have to do hard things. I sat in the back row next to my mother, my small hands folded in my lap, watching adults who I thought were reasonable and kind transform into something else. Something angry and unified and dangerous. The mayor spoke first. Talked about the need to protect the community, about how they had tolerated Eleanor Hartwell for too long, about how her presence had brought nothing but misfortune and fear. Then the police chief spoke. Said he couldn't arrest Eleanor because technically she hadn't committed any crimes. Said his hands were tied by laws that protected people like her. Said sometimes the law isn't enough. Sometimes citizens have to take responsibility for their own safety. Then my father stood up. I remember feeling proud in that moment, proud that my father was important enough to speak in front of everyone, proud that people listened when he talked. Proud that he was my father, and he was strong and certain and right. I was 8 years old. I didn't know any better. My father talked about protecting children, about protecting families, about protecting the town from people who didn't belong, who brought darkness and evil, who refused to leave when asked politely. He said Eleanor Hartwell had been given chances, had been tolerated for years. But tolerance had limits. Kindness had limits. There came a time when good people had to stand up and say, enough. He said the law wouldn't help them because the law protected criminals more than victims. Said they needed to take action themselves. Said they needed to make it clear that Eleanor Hartwell was not welcome in Millbrook Falls. He said they should give her until Halloween night to pack her things and leave town. Said if she refused, they would make her leave. Said whatever happened after that would be her own fault for being too stubborn to accept reality. The crowd roared its approval, stood and applauded and stamped their feet. 300 voices united in agreement. 300 people who had decided that one person's existence was intolerable. They voted, a show of hands. Should Eleanor Hartwell be forced to leave Millbrook Falls? Every single hand went up. Every single one, including my mother's. Including mine, because my mother raised my hand for me, and I didn't know I was allowed to say no. I remember looking around that room and seeing faces I knew, my teachers, my friends' parents, the librarian who helped me find books, the woman who ran the ice cream shop and always gave me extra sprinkles, good people, normal people, people who loved their children and paid their taxes and went to church every Sunday and believed they were doing the right thing. That's what terrifies me most when I think about that night. Not that humans are capable of cruelty, but that we're capable of cruelty while genuinely believing we're righteous. That we can vote to destroy someone's life and feel good about it. That we can transform from individuals into a mob and never even realize what we've become. After the vote, 3 men were chosen to deliver the message to Eleanor. My father was one of them. He volunteered. Said he would make sure she understood the seriousness of the situation. They went to her house that night. I know because I heard my father tell my mother about it when he came home. He said they knocked on her door. She opened it a crack, just enough to see who was there. My father said he could see the fear in her eyes. Good, he said. She should be afraid. Fear would make her cooperate. He told her she had until midnight on Halloween to be gone, told her the whole town had voted, told her if she was still there after midnight they would come back, and it wouldn't be friendly. My father said Eleanor tried to explain something, started to say something about needing time, about not having anywhere to go, about having reasons to stay. But he cut her off, told her he didn't care about her excuses. Told her she should have thought about the consequences before doing whatever she did to make the whole town hate her. Told her this was her last chance. She offered him money, he said, pulled out a worn envelope and said she had $800 saved, everything she had. Said she would give it all to him if he could give her more time, just a few more weeks. My father refused, said he wasn't a criminal, wasn't someone who could be bribed, said she was trying to corrupt him the way she corrupted everything else she touched. He came home that night feeling satisfied, feeling like he had done his civic duty, feeling like a hero. I watched him sit at the dinner table and eat the meal my mother had prepared, his hands steady, his conscience clear. Watched him kiss my mother goodnight. Watched him tuck me into bed and tell me he was proud of me for coming to the meeting, for learning what it meant to be part of a community, for understanding that sometimes we have to be strong. I didn't understand then what I was watching, didn't understand that good people can do terrible things, that the most dangerous evil isn't the obvious kind, the kind with horns and pitchforks and evil laughter. It's the kind that wears a suit and tie, that kisses its children goodnight, that believes with absolute certainty that it's right. Halloween came 2 days later. The town spent those 2 days in a state of anxious anticipation. Would she leave? Would she refuse? What would happen if she was still there after midnight? People drove past her house constantly, checking, watching. The lights stayed on in her windows. No moving truck appeared. No signs that she was packing. She was still there. She wasn't leaving. My father came home on October 31st with a grim determination. Halloween night. The deadline. He told my mother to prepare dinner early, said we would be going out later, said there was something that needed to be done. I didn't want to go trick-or-treating that night. Something felt wrong. The air felt heavy. The adults all had strange expressions. But my father insisted I wear my costume, said it would look suspicious if I didn't, said we needed to appear normal. So I put on my ghost costume, just a white sheet with holes cut for eyes. Simple, classic, the kind of costume 1,000 children were wearing that same night all across America. By 8 o'clock, as darkness fell and jack-o'-lanterns glowed on porches throughout Millbrook Falls, my father told me it was time to go. But we weren't going trick-or-treating. We were going to Eleanor Hartwell's house. I asked why. He said I would understand when we got there, said it was important that I saw this, said I needed to learn that actions have consequences. We drove there in our old Ford station wagon. The streets were full of children in costumes, parents walking with flashlights, the normal, happy chaos of Halloween night. But we drove past all of it, toward the edge of town where Eleanor Hartwell lived. When we arrived, I understood why my father had brought me. Everyone was there, hundreds of people, gathering in the dark, and they were carrying torches. Real torches, made from tree branches wrapped in cloth, soaked in kerosene. The flames danced and flickered in the cold October wind, casting shadows across faces I had known my whole life. It looked like something from a movie, from a nightmare, from a history book about things that happened in the past, things we had moved beyond, things civilized people didn't do anymore. But this was 1978. This was America. This was Connecticut, and 300 people were standing in front of a woman's house, holding burning torches because they had decided she didn't deserve to exist. Someone had brought jack-o'-lanterns, dozens of them, carved with angry, twisted faces. They lined the street in front of Eleanor's
like an
house,
audience
like waiting
sentries.
for a show to begin. The candles inside cast flickering orange light that made the carved mouths seem to move, seem to laugh. Children were there too, not just me, dozens of children in costumes, pirates and princesses and superheroes and monsters. We stood with our parents, not understanding what we were about to witness, not understanding that we were being taught the wrong lessons. My father took his place near the front of the crowd. Other men joined him. The leaders, the ones who had spoken at the town hall meeting, the ones everyone looked to for direction. The house was dark, every window black, not a single light showing. Eleanor Hartwell was inside, I knew that much. She had to be. Where else would she go? She had lived in that house her entire life. My father started to shout, his voice carried across the cold night air, loud enough for everyone to hear, loud enough for Eleanor to hear through her walls and locked doors. He told her to come out, said she had been given fair warning, said the deadline had passed, said if she came out now quietly, peacefully, they would let her leave with dignity. But if she refused, if she continued to hide, they would have no choice but to take action. The crowd joined in. A chorus of voices demanding she show herself, demanding she leave, demanding she pay for the imagined crimes they had convinced themselves she committed. I stood there in my ghost costume, my hand in my mother's hand, and I watched my father become someone I didn't recognize, watched his face twist with righteous anger, watched him transform from the man who tucked me into bed at night into something harder, something capable of terrible things. The house stayed dark, silent, no movement in the windows, no response to the shouting. Minutes passed, 5, 10. The crowd grew more agitated, started pushing forward. The torches started shouting back and forth, creating a hypnotic pattern of light and shadow. Then someone threw the first rock. It shattered a second-floor window. The sound cut through the shouting like a gunshot. For a moment, everything went quiet, as if the crowd itself was shocked by its own capacity for violence, but the silence only lasted a heartbeat. Then someone else threw another rock, and another, and another. The windows broke one by one, glass falling like deadly rain. Each broken window seemed to give the crowd permission to go further, to do worse, to stop pretending this was about justice and admit it was about something darker. People started screaming things I had never heard adults say before. Vile things, hateful things, things that would have gotten me punished if I had said them. But the adults could say them because they were united, because everyone was saying them, because in a mob, individual responsibility disappears into collective action. My father walked toward the front door. I followed, because I didn't know what else to do. My mother's hand had loosened its grip. She was caught up in the energy of the crowd. Everyone was. My father pounded on the door with his fist, demanded Eleanor open up, demanded she face what she had done, demanded she stop being a coward. No response. The crowd pushed closer. I could feel their heat, their anger, their certainty that what they were doing was right and necessary and just. My father stepped back from the door, looked at it for a long moment. Then he looked at the torch in his hand, at the flames dancing at the end of the branch, and I saw him make a decision. He pressed the torch against the door. The wood was old, dry. It had stood there for decades, weathered by seasons, but never weakened by fire. Until that moment. The flames caught immediately, spread across the surface of the door like hungry mouths consuming everything they touched. The crowd cheered. I remember the sound of that cheer, the way 300 voices united in approval, the way they celebrated destruction, the way they applauded violence. Other people rushed forward with their torches, pressed them against the walls, against the windows, against the porch. The fire spread faster than I thought possible, faster than anyone expected. Within minutes, the entire front of the house was burning, and still no sign of Eleanor Hartwell. Part of me hoped she had escaped somehow, had slipped out a back door while everyone was gathered at the front, was running through the woods towards safety. But another part of me, the part that had absorbed my father's certainty and my town's hatred, hoped she was inside. Hoped she was finally getting what she deserved. I was 8 years old. I didn't know any better. The heat from the fire pushed the crowd back. We stood in a semicircle, watching the flames climb higher, watching the house that had stood for generations being consumed in minutes. The jack-o'-lanterns' faces flickered in the firelight, their carved grins seeming to widen with satisfaction. Someone started singing. A hymn. Amazing Grace! Others joined in. Soon the whole crowd was singing a church hymn while watching a woman's home burn, singing about grace and salvation while committing an act that required neither. The cognitive dissonance should have been obvious. But when you're part of a mob, when everyone around you is doing the same thing, it all feels normal, right, necessary. The fire department arrived 20 minutes later, not because someone called them, because someone from the fire station was in the crowd and finally had the presence of mind to realize that maybe, just maybe, they should at least pretend to try to save the structure. They worked slowly, no urgency, no desperation. They sprayed water on the neighboring houses to keep the fire from spreading, but let Eleanor's house burn until it was clear the structure wouldn't collapse completely. By the time they had the fire under control, the damage was catastrophic. The front of the house was destroyed. The interior was ruined by smoke and water and flame. Everything Eleanor Hartwell owned, everything she had built her life around, was gone. The crowd began to disperse around midnight. People drifted away in small groups, talking quietly, their torches extinguished, their anger spent. They looked tired, satisfied, like people who had done a difficult job and could now rest, knowing it was complete. My father took me home, put me to bed, told me what we had witnessed was justice, said sometimes bad people need to be dealt with harshly, said I should be proud that my town stood up against evil. I lay awake for hours, smelling smoke on my ghost costume, hearing the crowd's cheers echoing in my mind, trying to understand why justice felt so much like cruelty. The next morning, Eleanor Hartwell was gone. Her house stood empty, charred and broken and abandoned. The police went through it carefully, looking for a body. They found nothing. No remains, no blood, no evidence that anyone had been inside when the fire started. Some people said she had escaped out the back during the chaos. Some said she had died and someone had moved the body. Some said she had never really been human at all, that she was some kind of demon who vanished when confronted by righteous fury. My father said nothing, Didn't speculate, didn't wonder. Just went to work the next day like nothing had happened, like he hadn't pressed a torch to a woman's door and watched her life burn. The town moved on quickly. Within a week, people had stopped talking about Eleanor Hartwell. Within a month, it was as if she had never existed. The burned house became invisible, just another abandoned structure on the edge of town that people drove past without seeing. I grew up in that town, graduated high school there, but I left the day I turned 18, went to college as far away as I could get, built a life that had nothing to do with Millbrook Falls. I never went back, not for holidays, not for reunions, not even when my mother died 10 years after that Halloween night. I built a career in service, started as a driver for a wealthy family, worked my way up, learned how the rich lived, how they thought, how they accumulated and protected and grew their fortunes. I was good at being invisible, good at listening, good at understanding what people needed before they asked. Maybe I learned that from Eleanor Hartwell, from watching how she survived by making herself disappear. Eventually I became wealthy myself, not as rich as the families I served, but comfortable. More than comfortable. I made wise investments, saved carefully, built a life of quiet prosperity. But I never forgot that Halloween night. Never stopped thinking about Eleanor Hartwell. Never stopped wondering what happened to her. And then, 40 years later, my father died. Heart attack. Quick. He was 82 years old, had lived a long life, a full life. Everyone said he was a good man, a pillar of the community. I flew back to Millbrook Falls, someone who would be missed. First time in decades. The town had changed, grown, brought in chain stores and coffee shops, but underneath the new paint, it was still the same place, still built on the same foundations, still carrying the same secrets. The funeral was well attended, hundreds of people, many I didn't recognize, some I did, older now, grayer, but with the same faces that had held torches 40 years earlier. No one mentioned Eleanor Hartwell, not once. As if that night had been erased from collective memory, as if it had never happened at all. After the funeral, I stayed to settle my father's estate. He had left me everything, the house, his savings, his personal effects. I should have donated it all and left. Should have taken the money and walked away and never thought about Millbrook Falls again. But I couldn't, because there was something I needed to understand. Some missing piece that would explain why my father, why all of them, had done what they did. I went through his things methodically. Clothes, furniture, books, old photographs, looking for something, anything, some sign of regret, some acknowledgement that what happened that night was wrong. I found the box on the third day, in the back of his bedroom closet, unmarked, locked with a combination lock. The lawyer had given me the combination along with the keys to the house. Said my father had been specific in his will, said the box was meant for me, said I should open it alone. I sat on my father's bedroom floor and opened that box. Inside were documents, newspaper clippings about Eleanor Hartwell, about the fire, about her disappearance, printed carefully, saved deliberately, as if my father had been keeping track, making sure he didn't forget. And beneath the clippings, a journal, my father's journal, leather-bound, filled with his careful handwriting. Entries dating back to 1975 and continuing until just 3 days before he died. I opened it at random, started reading, and within minutes I realized I was holding the truth I had been searching for my entire adult life. My father wrote about Eleanor Hartwell, about the rumors that summer, about the meetings, about the decision to force her out of town. But he also wrote about something else. Something no one in Millbrook Falls knew. Something he had kept secret for 40 years. Eleanor Hartwell wasn't alone in that house on Halloween night 1978. Someone else was living with her, someone she was protecting. In July of that year, a young woman had appeared in Millbrook Falls, 19 years old, pregnant, running from something, someone. She had no money, no family, no place to go. She'd been sleeping behind the church when Eleanor found her one morning, brought her home, gave her a room, promised to help her until she figured out what to do next. The young woman's name was Sarah. She was 8 months pregnant. terrified. Her ex-boyfriend had been violent, dangerous. She had run as far as she could, which turned out to be Millbrook Falls. Eleanor knew that if anyone found out Sarah was living with her, they would ask questions, would want to know who she was, where she came from, and eventually those questions would lead Sarah's ex-boyfriend right to her. So Eleanor kept it secret, bought extra groceries early in the morning, made sure no one saw Sarah come or go, protected her the only way she could, by making sure no one knew she existed. That's why the lights were on at strange hours, because Sarah was awake at night, unable to sleep, pacing the floors of a stranger's house and wondering how her life had gone so wrong so quickly. That's why people heard sounds, because there were two people living in that house, not one. Two people moving around, two people breathing, two people trying to survive. When little Michael Chen went missing, Sarah had been in the woods. She went for walks sometimes, needed air, needed space, needed to feel like she wasn't trapped. She had seen Michael playing in his treehouse, had made sure he was okay, had gone back to Eleanor's house without realizing anyone had seen her. But someone had seen her, from a distance, in Eleanor's coat, and they had assumed it was Eleanor. Eleanor never corrected them, never explained, never defended herself. Because defending herself meant revealing Sarah's presence, meant putting a vulnerable young woman and her unborn child in danger. So Eleanor Hartwell let an entire town believe she was a monster, let them hate her, let them fear her, let them plan her destruction, because the alternative was betraying someone who needed protection. My father knew all of this. He wrote about it in his journal, wrote about going to Eleanor's house 3 days before Halloween, about being let inside, about Eleanor explaining everything. She had begged him, had explained about Sarah, about the pregnancy, about the danger, had asked for just a few more weeks, just until the baby was born. Then she would help Sarah get to a women's shelter in the city, would make sure both of them were safe. She had offered him money, $800, everything she had saved over years of seamstress work, had held it out with shaking hands and pleaded with him to give her time. My father had refused. He wrote about it plainly, coldly, wrote that he told her the town had made its decision and nothing would change that. Wrote that she should have thought about the consequences before harboring strangers. Wrote that sometimes innocent people suffer when others make foolish choices. Eleanor had cried, had begged, had explained that Sarah had nowhere else to go, that sending her away meant sending her back to the man who had beaten her, who had threatened to kill her if she tried to leave. My father had been unmoved, had told Eleanor she had until Halloween night, had walked away and let events unfold exactly as they did. The night they burned the house, Sarah had been inside, 8 months pregnant, hiding in the basement, terrified. Eleanor had concealed her in a closet, had covered her with blankets, had told her to stay silent no matter what happened. When my father pressed his torch to the door, he knew. He knew there were 2 people in that house. He knew one of them was pregnant. He knew, and he did it anyway. He wrote about watching the fire spread, about wondering if they would escape, about knowing he had just done something monstrous, but feeling unable to stop, feeling like he had gone too far to turn back. Eleanor and Sarah had escaped through a basement window, while the crowd watched the front of the house burn, had run into the woods, had disappeared into darkness while 300 people celebrated destruction. My father never told anyone, never warned anyone that there had been someone else in the house. Let the town believe Eleanor had fled alone. Let them forget. Let them move on. And then he spent the next 40 years living with what he had done. The journal entries after that night were different, darker, shorter. He wrote about nightmares, about waking up at 3 in the morning smelling smoke, about seeing Eleanor's face in crowds, even though he knew she was gone. He wrote about going to the burned house sometimes, standing outside it, looking at what remained, trying to understand what he had become, how he had transformed from a man who believed he was good into someone capable of attempted murder. He wrote about church, about sitting in pews, listening to sermons about love and forgiveness, and wondering if God could forgive what he had done, what they had all done. He wrote about growing old in a town that had forgotten, that had convinced itself the fire was justified, that had erased Eleanor Hartwell from memory and moved forward without consequence or accountability. And in his final entry, dated 3 days before his heart attack, he wrote about me, about how he had brought me to that fire, about how he had taught me the wrong lessons, about how he hoped that someday I would understand what he couldn't bring himself to say out loud. He wrote, "I have carried this weight for 40 years. I thought I was protecting my family, my town, my community. I thought I was doing what was right, but I was a coward. We were all cowards. We chose fear over compassion. We chose mob justice over human decency. Eleanor Hartwell was innocent, and we tried to kill her for it. I don't know if she survived. I don't know what happened to Sarah or her child, but I know this. Whatever judgment waits for me, I have earned it. May God have mercy on my soul, because I showed none to Eleanor Hartwell that night." I sat in that closet for hours after reading those words, sat in the dark with my father's journal in my hands, trying to process what I had learned. Everything I thought I knew about that night was a lie. Everything I had believed about my father, about my town, about Eleanor Hartwell, was wrong. My father had known the truth, had known Eleanor was protecting someone, had known she was innocent, and he had burned her house anyway. I needed to know what happened to her, needed to know if she survived, needed to know if there was any way to make this right. I hired investigators, private detectives who specialized in finding people who didn't want to be found. I gave them everything I had, the journal, the dates, Eleanor's full name, the description of Sarah from my father's writings. It took them 6 months, 6 months of searching records and following leads and knocking on doors. 6 months of dead ends and false starts and moments when they thought they would never find her. But they did. Eleanor Hartwell was alive. She had survived that night. She and Sarah had made it to Hartford, had found a women's shelter, had stayed there through the winter. Sarah's baby had been born in late November 1978. A healthy girl, 8 pounds, 3 ounces. Sarah had named her Emma Hartwell, gave her Eleanor's last name as a thank you, as recognition that Eleanor had saved both their lives. Sarah had eventually gotten back on her feet, found work, found a small apartment, raised her daughter with Eleanor's help. They had stayed together for years, Eleanor and Sarah and little Emma, not as housemates but as family, the family Eleanor had never been allowed to have in Millbrook Falls. They had moved several times, always staying in touch, always considering each other family. Sarah had eventually married a good man, had given Emma siblings, had built a stable, loving life. Emma had grown up and gone to college, had become a social worker specializing in helping vulnerable women, women like her mother had been, women running from violence, women with nowhere else to go. Eleanor had lived quietly, had worked various jobs under different names, always keeping to herself, never staying anywhere long enough to build roots, never trusting communities again after what Millbrook Falls had done. The investigators found her living in Portland, Maine, a small apartment in a quiet neighborhood. She was 73 years old, living alone, still bearing the scar that had defined her entire life. I flew to Portland the day I received the investigators' report, didn't call ahead, didn't know what I would say, just knew I needed to see her, needed to tell her the truth, needed to apologize for what my father did, what I watched, what our town did to her. I knocked on her door on a Tuesday afternoon in March 2019, 40 years and 5 months after Halloween 1978. She answered slowly, looked at me with eyes that had seen too much suffering, eyes that were still somehow kind. I told her who I was, told her my father's name, watched recognition flash across her face, watched her remember. She invited me in. We talked for 3 hours. I told her about finding the journal, about spending 40 years not knowing what my father had done. She told me about that night, about hiding Sarah in the basement, about breathing smoke through wet towels, about hearing the crowd outside chanting for her death, about escaping through the window while the fire raged, about running through the woods with a pregnant woman and wondering if they would survive until morning. She told me about Sarah, about helping raise Emma, about watching them build a beautiful life, about feeling proud that she had saved them even though it cost her everything. She told me about forgiveness, about how she had spent years being angry, then tired, then finally simply accepting that some things couldn't be fixed, that some injustices couldn't be balanced, that sometimes survival was victory enough. I asked if she would come back to Millbrook Falls to tell her story, to let the town know what they had done, to force them to acknowledge their crime. She smiled sadly and shook her head, said she had no interest in revenge or vindication, said the people who burned her house probably didn't even remember her name, said digging up the past wouldn't help anyone, but she thanked me for coming, said it meant something that someone finally knew the truth, that someone cared enough to find out what really happened. We said goodbye at her door. She hugged me. This woman who had every reason to hate me, to hate my family, to hate everyone from Millbrook Falls. She hugged me and told me it wasn't my fault, that I was just a child, that children shouldn't be held responsible for what adults do. I drove away from her apartment feeling hollowed out, feeling like everything I had built my life on was sand. I went back to Millbrook Falls one last time, drove to the house where Eleanor had lived. Someone had renovated it years ago, turned it into a rental property. The charred door was gone, the broken windows replaced, fresh paint covered every surface, all evidence of that Halloween night erased. I stood outside that house and thought about the mob, about my father, about the 8-year-old boy in a ghost costume who watched it all and did nothing. The people who did this still live in Millbrook Falls. Some of them, the ones who haven't died or moved away. They're grandparents now, respected members of the community. They volunteer at schools. They run businesses. They sit on town councils. They probably don't think about Eleanor Hartwell anymore. Probably don't remember that Halloween night. Or if they do, they've convinced themselves it was justified, that she was dangerous, that they were protecting their families. That's how people live with terrible things. They tell themselves stories until the stories become truth. I could expose them, could tell the world what happened, could bring shame and consequences to a town that has lived too long without either. But Eleanor asked me not to, said she just wanted peace, said she had spent 40 years rebuilding her life and didn't want to spend whatever time she had left reliving her trauma. So I honored her request. I kept her secret, just like she kept Sarah's secret, just like she protected someone vulnerable even when it cost her everything. But I needed to tell this story, needed to say it out loud. Needed to make sure someone, somewhere, knows what happened on Halloween 1978. Because if we forget these stories, we're doomed to repeat them. I am 72 years old now, the same age Eleanor was when I found her. I have wealth beyond measure. I have traveled the world. I have served presidents and kings and billionaires. But the wisest person I ever met was a woman with a scarred face who chose to protect a stranger instead of protecting herself, who survived a mob's hatred without becoming hateful, who forgave people who never asked for forgiveness. Eleanor Hartwell taught me something that 40 years of wealth and power never could. That true strength isn't measured in money or influence. It's measured in how we treat people who can't benefit us, how we respond to those who are vulnerable, how we act when no one is watching. On Halloween night 1978, 300 people tried to kill a woman because she looked different. Because she lived quietly, because she protected someone vulnerable. 300 people, not monsters, not psychopaths, just ordinary people who convinced themselves that fear justified violence, that community safety required cruelty, that good people sometimes have to do terrible things. They were wrong, and the worst part is they'll never know how wrong they were. They'll die believing they were righteous, that they protected their town, that they did what needed to be done. But they didn't protect anyone. They destroyed an innocent woman's life. They taught their children that hatred is acceptable if enough people agree. They proved that civilization is far more fragile than we want to believe. I was there that night. I watched it happen. I did nothing. I was 8 years old, powerless, unable to understand what I was seeing. But I was there, part of the crowd, part of the mob, holding my father's hand while a woman's life burned. That makes me complicit in a way I'll never escape. Eleanor forgave me, forgave the town, forgave everyone. She found peace in survival, built a new life, helped others, chose compassion over bitterness. I don't know if I can do the same. I don't know if I can forgive my father. He's dead now. His confession sits in a journal in a box in my house. His apology came 40 years too late and only to himself. But maybe forgiveness isn't the point. Maybe the point is remembering, making sure this story doesn't disappear into comfortable forgetfulness, because the house we burned isn't in Millbrook Falls, it's in our collective conscience. And until we acknowledge what we're capable of, until we face the truth about human nature and fear and mob mentality, we'll keep burning houses, we'll keep destroying the innocent, we'll keep choosing fear over compassion. Eleanor Hartwell is still alive, still living quietly in Portland, still bearing the scars that prejudice gave her. She wants nothing from this story, no apology, no recognition, no justice, but I needed to tell it anyway, for the people who need to hear it, for the person who might be standing in a crowd one day, torch in hand, wondering if what they're about to do is right. For that person, I want you to remember Eleanor Hartwell. Remember that the monster you're hunting might just be someone trying to survive, someone protecting the vulnerable, someone who has committed no crime except existing differently. Remember that the houses we burn tonight become the guilt we carry tomorrow. Remember that mobs are made of individuals, and each individual has a choice. On Halloween night 1978, 300 people made the wrong choice, including my father. Including me, even as a child who didn't know better. Don't be number 301. If this story moved you, if it made you think differently about justice and fear and human nature, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Because the only way we stop repeating history is by remembering what we're capable of when we forget our humanity. Share this story. Help make sure Eleanor Hartwell's courage isn't forgotten. And maybe together we can make sure no one else has to survive what she survived.